Hi, this is Caroline Stephen, share trader and journalist, and I'm very excited to bring this interview today with Simone Dawson from Optim Outcomes. Simone is a trained psychologist, and she brings the very best of psychology, lived experience, and success as a consultant and a businesswoman. Simone is helping people transition to a new COVID normal, and she says her reason for being is people health for business wealth. Simone is specifically focusing on areas in trauma and mental and emotional health. And she's currently working with a breakthrough coaching package called Triumph Out of Trauma. I hope you enjoy. Simone Dawson from Optim Outcomes. Hello and welcome back to Talking Trading.
Hi, Caroline. Thank you so much for having me. It's absolutely wonderful to be here and connect with you again.
Simone, we're talking about mental health and trauma in a COVID business world and our road to recovery. Simone, I know you are extremely passionate about this topic. So 2 questions. Why is it so important to you? And secondly, why do you feel that time's of the essence?
Okay, I'll go in that nice order. Thanks, Caroline. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to start with a bit of a story, and by the end of it, a few of you might go, I've kind of heard of that before. Chris Gardner grew up in a home where he witnessed his stepfather brutally abusing his mother and sisters. He was placed in foster care after his mother was arrested for trying to burn down the house with her abuser inside. Despite that, Gardner grew up with dreams of becoming a doctor. When it didn't work out, he took a job as a medical sales rep in San Francisco. He became a father and eventually wound up as a single dad, struggling to make ends meet as he basically had to care for his young son on the streets. His son and himself would spend nearly a year on those streets, homeless and bouncing from shelter to shelter, sleeping on public transport or in parks until Gardner could get back on his feet. Eventually, Gardner acquired a spot in a trainee program at a stock brokerage firm, having no experience at all in stocks, and the position paid no salary. But it started him down a path that would lead him to becoming CEO and founder of his own firm, which then grew into a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He went on to fund a $50 million project in San Francisco, creating low-income housing and employment opportunities in the area of the city where he himself was homeless. He penned an autobiography that was made into a movie. Anybody remember Will Smith in the movie Happiness? If you don't, I really highly recommend it. But I've been working with a fabulous coach. Some of you probably know him, Jason Cunningham. We've had some great times together. And Jason's line with me quite frequently is, but what's the point, Sim? The point is trauma does not have to end you. It doesn't have to be your victim story. It can be your opportunity. It can teach you so many lessons. So whilst today I really want to focus on, I guess, what trauma is, how we can actually work with it, because it's very real, but we can respond to it in a number of different ways. And today I want to introduce an idea about triumphing, coming out bigger and better than before, how we actually look after ourselves within mental health, how we look after ourselves within trauma as well. The second question, and I'm proud of myself for remembering, is that time is of the essence. And I think particularly those of us in Victoria, we basically understand that we are emerging from what feels like a bit of a bad dream, let's be frank. And we've got a whole lot of things in our brain that have changed and emotional experiences. So none of us are coming out the same as when we went in. And I'll be quite honest with you, it's critical now because whilst, yes, we could do something in 12 months' time, the opportunity to either not survive, just survive, or thrive, we're at a segue, we're at a crossroads right now. Just want to throw in a few other, I suppose, examples of where trauma has basically not only meant survival, but success. Oprah Winfrey, Barbara Streisand, Charlize Theron, and Lady Gaga. Charlize's story is quite profound. I'd love to talk about all of these super stories, but I know that we've got, limited time. So my point is triumph from tragedy is possible. And the reason I'm so passionate is we, and I say we, I mean you, Caroline, I mean Chris and Louise, I mean all of us as leaders in our homes, in our families, in our workplaces. We're leaders in our own destiny. We have an opportunity to break the cycle and not be a victim. And I really believe emphatically about that. I've rattled off some famous names, and whilst I'm not yet anywhere near one of them, one day maybe, what I am is I've lived it. I've lived trauma. I've lived a lifetime of it. It's shaped me. It's scarred me. I've had to fight for life over and over. And those who know me tell me it's actually what's made me me. And I have to then say, I wouldn't give it back. I've laid in a hospital bed. I've spent 4 months in hospital. I had less than a 1% chance of survival. And yes, I survived, but I also made a conscious decision that I got through that much. It's now time to live my best life. And that's why this podcast is so exciting to me, Caroline, because I think other people, we are all in a similar position that we've got opportunity right now to pave the way, whatever way we want to.
Simone, there are different signs and symptoms of trauma, and there are different sorts of trauma. Can you touch on what they are?
Absolutely. So let's talk about the traumas that we'll probably all relate to at some point already. The first is acute trauma, and that is usually a single incident, an incident, I should say, rather than instance. It could be an instance in time, but it's usually an incident. Think car accident, think natural disaster, one single event, and this is what we often link most closely with, I'll say it once, then abbreviate it from now on, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Basically, single events often lead to the PTSD diagnosis, which I'll explain a little bit later as different to other mental health conditions. The next one is chronic trauma. Chronic trauma is basically repeated and prolonged exposure to something. Now, let me talk about that something, because I kind of have to go backwards to go forwards here. I think it's really important that we can all put on a hat of no judgment, in that it's not up to me to decide for you what trauma is. I had lunch with Jason today. I hope he doesn't kill me for talking about him. And he was a bit traumatised because my chicken salad looked better than Jason's chicken salad. And I was using an example of trauma is actually an event or a series of events that we experience as traumatic or harmful or threatening. I can't tell Jason that him not getting a salad that looked as good as mine isn't traumatic for him. So I really want to iterate that trauma is the experience of something as an individual.
Can I just ask, sorry, I'm jumping in here.
Absolutely.
What percentage of the population has or does experience trauma?
I can give you a really interesting fact. So the successful population, and I know that your traders, your audience generally are pretty successful people. They're ambitious. They want a lot for themselves, and unapologetically, I think it's fabulous. So high performing people, generally we're looking at 60 to 80% have gone through some form of trauma, whether it's mild, whether it's one incident, whether it's chronic trauma, or the last one, Caroline, is called complex trauma. And that often happens in childhood, where you might have neglect, there might be physical abuse, there might be addiction in the household, there might be domestic violence. So we're talking about multiple complex layers. I think where we're all coming out of COVID, I think to a degree, so whilst I'm almost reading my fine print here, Caroline, whilst trauma is the experience of someone, so no one's ever in a position to say you are or you aren't, or it's legitimate or it isn't, that lives on the continuum, that person's perception and experience of something. But if we say, yes, we are traumatised, that also lives on the continuum. So what I'm going to say unequivocally, 100% of us, particularly in Victoria, are all traumatised right now. It's just a question of, I know, what is it, time plus tragedy plus time equals comedy. I'm hoping we're there soon. But I think that we're all coming out of a trauma of some shape or form. Even if it's just that, our brains have changed and we're concerned that we're not as sharp. We're fearful about our financial security. We've all been impacted in some way, and that's why it's so timely that you're giving me the opportunity to talk about this. So thank you.
So what are the symptoms and the signs that we should be looking for in trauma?
Look, there are lots and they vary a lot amongst people. There's no one formula that, applies to everybody. And there's, of course, more than what I'm talking about today. I'm very happy to talk offline if people have questions. So in the emotional kind of category, we see lots of things ranging from denial, anger, fear, sadness, shame, confusion, numbness. And the next two I'm going to name because they come up as both moods, depression and anxiety, but they also can come up under an actual clinical condition, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But experience of feeling depressed in given moments or feeling anxious is not unusual. Hopelessness, irritability, or difficulty concentrating. I don't know about you or the listeners, but I know I've probably experienced most of them at some point, probably more than once over the last 6 months. Let's talk about, sorry, better come up for air there. Let's talk about some physical symptoms, and I'm sure people can relate to this. Feeling fatigued, feeling tired, feeling jumpy or edgy, sweating, headaches, digestive issues, issues with sleeping. And whilst this isn't a type of trauma, I've kind of coined the idea that we can have what's called post-traumatic growth. Where I guess how I'll summarise it is we've learned that negative experiences can spur positive change. We can have a recognition of personal strength. We can explore new possibilities. We can improve relationships, greater appreciation for life, spiritual growth. We see this in people who've endured war, natural disasters, bereavement, job loss, serious illness, economic stress, and injuries. So I'm going to put it out there, and it's a bit bold. Despite the misery resulting from the coronavirus outbreak, we could expect to develop beneficial elements as a result. And who thought I would have been talking about COVID and trauma and going, let's get excited about the opportunities, but I believe in it.
Is there a fourth type of trauma?
Well, I'm going to say that the fourth type is probably a bit of a combo, to be honest with you. And I'd like to say that trauma in itself is defined as harmful result of an experience. And I'm actually going to say that the fourth type is trauma growth. So it's actually a negative experience that we turn on its head. That's my fourth. Is there a fourth? Possibly. But I'm being, taking creative license and trying to create my own.
So post-traumatic stress, anxiety, and depression you mentioned, they're so common. I think every listener is going to be relating to them. Can we touch on them just a little bit more?
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks for that question. I guess what I want to kind of put out there in the first instance, that if anything I talk about is triggering, and look, it is even for me.
Ring Simone.
Ring Simone, or right back at you, ring Caroline. Or I guess there's some fabulous support avenues at this point. Beyond Blue, Lifeline, they've been doing a whole lot of stuff, whether it's a virtual chat room or a hotline. If anything is triggering you, if you feel unsafe, please get some support, whether it is Caroline or myself, or whether it is one of those formal places. Please don't hold back. 100%. So what I want to talk about is, I'll talk about what the symptoms of anxiety and depression are. And I'll also name, before I go into them, the idea that they live in a clinical diagnosis and they exist on a continuum. So some people might say, I have been diagnosed with depression, but I was high functioning. I could go to work. I could engage with my family. I maintained life. Others are further down on the continuum. They might not have showered for a month. They couldn't get out of bed. So that's kind of my disclaimer before I go into it, saying that everybody's experience or diagnosis exists somewhere. There is no right or wrong, or more real or less hard or more hard. So some of the symptoms of anxiety might be feelings of restlessness, being on edge, feeling really worried, being irritable, difficulties with concentration, difficulties either staying asleep or even falling asleep. I'm sure most of us have suffered some of this since we've been in this COVID world. So whether it's a clinical diagnosis or not, if you're confused or if you want clarity, your GP is a great starting point for that. What we see in depression, and I'm a bit bold and I'll kind of talk about the hard stuff, so excuse in advance, but if we lose our sexual desire, if we have changes in appetites, whether it's for sex or food or even the normal activities that we enjoy and love, they're often symptoms of depression. We often sleep too much or not enough. We maybe eat too much or not enough. We feel agitated, we feel fatigued, often worthlessness or feelings of guilt, not uncommon. And this is where I'm actually going to name some of that triggering stuff. Thoughts or even actions around harming yourself, thoughts of death or suicide, even attempts at suicide. This is the really pointy edge of it. You know, this is where we lose people we love, and it's really concerning. Again, if I've triggered, please reach out. My one last, I suppose, mental health diagnosis I'm going to touch on is PTSD. That differs from, call it, the impacts of trauma, in that it's actually a psychiatric condition. It has diagnostic criteria, such as re-experiencing the trauma, emotional numbness, or even, call it, being hypervigilant or increased arousal. So think if you went out with a friend who returned from Iraq for coffee, sitting in a, I don't know, a mall, and a car backfired, they'd dive for cover, start shaking and petrified, thinking it was a gunshot. So if you're not sure whether, am I just impacted by trauma or do I have a diagnosis, again, please reach out, GP, counsellor, whoever, and get some support around that.
So Sim, other than people reaching out to their counsellor or GP support, what are other self-care strategies that people can use to go get over this trauma?
Perfect. So I guess something I will just add in there, I named Oprah Winfrey and Charlize Theron because they've got traumas they've declared. There are other really successful people that have also really been hard on sleeve about their mental health status. So people like Jim Carrey, J.K. Rowling, and Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys was actually diagnosed, I'm reading this here because I want to pronounce it correctly, schizoaffective disorder. So we're talking, real psychiatric, the pointy end of the stick, yet very high functioning, successful lives. So really my reason for being here today is to give us permission to be compassionate about calling out struggles, whether they're mental illness, whether they're trauma. Let's get okay with talking about it, because many successful people live with it, alongside it, and hard on sleeve, they're talking about it. So why can't we?
What does Jim Carrey say? What's Jim Carrey's situation?
He's clinically depressed.
Right.
And isn't it, I'm gonna say this, and I'm definitely gonna keep people anonymous. I've been really privileged to be led into the very, very rich and complex worlds of some famous comedians in Australia. And their biggest struggle is self-esteem, lack of confidence, and clinical depression. So don't be surprised that some of the people that seem most successful and are most successful, their evidence says we can live alongside this stuff. We can thrive. It doesn't have to end us or put us in bed. And it's certainly nothing that we have to be ashamed about. So thank you for letting me digress off the track of what we can do to do well within it. So I'm going to touch on a few things, and I'll try and kind of move through it quickly because each in its own could be an hour. Balanced lifestyle in general, good sleep health, good eating health, eating a balanced diet, trying to have a balance around how much alcohol. And I know that the liquor industry has done remarkably well out of COVID. I don't know whether to go, oh, am I worried, or hey, maybe I'm one of them. But either way, I think we have to acknowledge that managing alcohol and managing that balance with, enjoyable activities, good food, good sleep, it's really critical. I'm going to touch on exercise and call it out in its own right. We know that when we're anxious or we're triggered, that exercise, or let's backpedal, fight or flight, our body's sympathetic nervous system, it's very smart at keeping us alive. If we feel traumatized or the world's closing in, our body kicks into this mode of run, fight, run. Now, what we actually know is that exercise counteracts that response, and it kicks into gear what's called our parasympathetic nervous system, kicks us back into a bit of a homeostasis, a baseline where we're a bit more calm. I'd like to recommend 30 minutes a day, a few days a week, where exercise can be preventative, so it helps us actually stay away from panic and trauma, and it's actually curative. So if you're going, I'm not coping, need to do something to ground myself, exercise can be great, as can mindfulness. And I'm going to call that out as its own element and its own activity. Again, I'd love to talk about mindfulness and using your senses to really be present and in the moment, but it's probably another hour that we don't have. So I'll just touch on it that way. And I'm going to say broadly, connection with others is really critical. Whether you're talking about your trauma or your problems, or, excuse my French, and I know, Chris, you won't mind this at all, whether you're talking shit. Talking shit can be great. Watching Netflix and having a bit of a binge on chips and dip. Go do it. You know, I think defining yourself by your trauma and your problems does no favours for anyone's. If you really want to focus in, nothing wrong with coaching, with therapy, support groups, online chat rooms, hotlines, you name it, it's out there for you.
So let's say we're trading from home. We've got a family member who's suffering some depression. What do we do to reach out and support them? Or a friend or a girlfriend?
Yeah, there's a lot to keep in mind. So whether, and I want to broaden it, Caroline, it's a brilliant question, but it's broader than just depression. I think if we are struggling emotionally, whether we've got diagnosed depression, anxiety, some of those symptoms of trauma that we've touched on before, I think there's some really, some key tips to kind of reaching out and engaging with people. I think be willing to support them by talking about the trauma, but only if they raise it. Don't go, so Caroline, I know you got hit by a car a year ago. How are you coping with that? You know, be gentle, let them initiate. They'll let you know. You don't have to be an amateur psychologist. Sometimes just listening without judgment, being caring alongside someone can make the world of difference. I think reassuring someone that whatever their experience is, whatever they're going through, it's their normal and it's probably really understandable. One big thing I want to emphasise, mainly because it's all about me and I know I need to do better with it, don't take stuff personally. You know, when people are hurting, they hurt. They hurt others when people are hurting themselves. They might be irritable, cranky. They might be frightened. They might lash out. Try not to take it personally. Try to kind of remind yourself they're struggling right now. You know, when a dog gets hit by a car and you go to pat it, it might bite you. Not because it doesn't want your love and support, but because it's hurting. I think reminding people about the things they used to love and the routines that help them can be fabulous. Be available just to listen, to talk shit, to watch Netflix, to bake cookies together, whatever it might be. And I think that if you're feeling that maybe they need a bit of encouragement for some professional support, put it out there in a gentle way that's not directing them, but just suggesting it to them.
That is such good advice. Are there any additional considerations for 2020 in this bizarre year that we've just lived through that you can touch on right now?
Oh my goodness, I'm going to have to hold myself back. I did 10 years of university studies in psychology, and the whole 10 years I complained endlessly about research and the science. And why do I have to know statistics and be able to read journal articles? And Caroline, I have spent the last month neck deep. I'm traumatised by my inability to enunciate. Neck deep in research, validating some scientific theories that I've come up with. And I know people have changed. Our brains have changed. Our bodies have changed. So I'm going to touch on a couple of reasons why they've changed. The first one is think about our sensory experiences. Personally, I know a year ago, I was running through airports. I was probably having dinner with the likes of someone like you. I was probably having coffee with a friend. I was probably in meeting rooms. I was walking the city streets in my lunch break to have a bit of an exercise. You know, so what was I seeing? What was I hearing? What was I smelling? Have you got any recollections of, say, a year ago? What were you doing that was just normal sensory experience every day?
I would love to answer this question. I was in Greece this time last year.
Okay. If you wanted to make me jealous, you've succeeded. So I'm on the beach smelling a tropical cocktail of some sort, hearing the ocean, feeling the hot sand, having the breeze, smelling the coconut oil, and hearing the play of others who are also so unfortunate to be lying on a beach in Greece. How did you get through? Anyway, we'll talk about that another time. But ultimately, if our brains are amplifiers or it's a microphone input, let's thank our brains for being hypervigilant. They keep us alive. So our brains, our senses are ultimately pathways to address danger, danger, danger. What we see, what we hear, it keeps us alive. So what's going to happen if everything gets quieter? If we can't hear, if we can't smell, if we're not touching much stuff, our brains need a certain level of detectability to be able to keep us safe. So it's going to turn up the amplifier. Great. So while we're in lockdown, our amplifier's loud and the microphone is noisy. What's going to happen when we get back out and those horns are blasting and those coffee shops are noisy and our work kitchen is full of all these noises? I'm calling it lockdown hyperesthesia because ultimately we're going to feel really frightened and on edge and impacted. We're going to be oversensitive. So I'm not telling you that because you've got to be scared, but I think everybody, knowledge is power. So understand, be compassionate with yourself, be compassionate with others. If you're getting out there and feeling a bit threatened and restless and unsafe and hypervigilant, there's a reason why. The second bit of science I want to share, and I bet you're sorry you asked the question, is that we actually rely on, apologise. Why don't people turn off their phones, Caroline? Okay, so we actually rely on sensory input to generate energy in our brain. Now, lucky the research ethics in 1969 weren't as hardcore as they are now, because they did some research in the Canadian Journal of Psychiatry on a lockdown prison population. And we know that the effects of sensory deprivation in short bursts gives our brain a break from that hypervigilance. So think the sensory deprivation tank, but it's only for half an hour. It doesn't actually create any long-term adaptive changes to our brain that are detrimental. But, you know, these psychiatrists in Canada in the late 60s went, I'm sure what we're doing to these prisoners isn't actually good for them. Let's use them as guinea pigs and see what's actually happening for them. They developed a theory called input-output theory. And what that basically tells us is that energy is transmitted into our sensory system through our senses and converted in our neural structures into, literally, the spark of life. So in terms of being cognitively sharp, in terms of problem solving, learning, being switched on, being energized, if we've got a reduction in our external stimuli, we're kind of living underwater, to be quite frank. And I have to be honest, I've been really blessed with talking to people that have made themselves vulnerable and told me, I'm not as sharp, I don't feel as efficient, as effective, I'm not firing the way I used to. The good news is you'll come back from that. The other good news is there's an explanation and you're actually not dumb. You know, you haven't lost your snappy, sharp mind. And I know for traders, you know, discipline and focus, it's essential, right? I've spoken to Louise about it a number of times about it's not interesting trading. It's not exciting. It's not arousing. There is a formula. There is discipline. And being able to dull out distractions and focus in is really critical. Now, this input-output theory tells us that if you're trading, you've probably struggled a little bit. Let me talk a little bit more about some of the actual defined symptoms. Do I have a couple of minutes to go through that?
Just a couple, just touch on them.
Beautiful. So we know that our concentration is impacted. We know that we're sluggish and we're apathetic. We know that we're very sensitive in a sensory way, which is going to make us very distractible. We know that our lateral thinking, our problem solving, our speed of processing has all slowed down. We know that we are actually lumbering like a vestibular system, which is our balance center in our brain. We've lost spatial awareness because we're not in that variety of environments anymore. Emotionally, we're kind of not as sharp. We're in a bit of a slump. Our energy is low. So look, I'm not going to go too much more into it. I really could spend an hour on it. Thank you for at least touching me on let me touch on a couple. But I guess in how does that translate? If you're a successful trader, what is this stuff going to mean for you? Concerns about money and cash flow. We know that being an emotive trader, a fear-based trader, I've heard Chris and Louise talk about this all the time, trading from fear, being emotive and not trusting the formula, the science, doesn't lead you to good places. So these emotions you might be experiencing, being fearful about economic security, there's going to take some discipline not to be pulled into that fear space. We know we're distracted. We know that we're not sharp. Therefore, could we be missing, and I'm going to use Louise and Chris terminology, entry and exit triggers? Is that the correct term? Thanks,
Correct.
Caroline.
Correct.
Basically, are we mistyping orders because people are out there distracted? And that really is Chris and Louise language. So I feel really smart saying that. I guess the other thing, and this is big, and I know for me, not feeling as sharp, not feeling as energized, as motivated, I basically know that a little bit of self-doubt, a little bit of confidence has crept in. Are you losing confidence about the judgments you're making when trading? Are you having doubts? Should I be full-time trading? If I'm not as smart, if I'm not as savvy as I was a year ago, what right do I have to have been here? Is imposter syndrome creeping back in? We've talked about that with Chris and Louise before. So these are all things that, whilst they're not necessarily changeable the second you learn about them, I guess it's opportunity, right? I'm going to circle back to the initial point that trauma can be triumph. And I put it out to all of you. You are smart, ambitious, motivated go-getters. What are you going to turn COVID on its head to mean for you?
For this font of wisdom, are there any special offers you'd like to offer listeners who have tuned in?
I've worked quite closely with Louise before and I love it. I have to say, both what I get out of Chris and Louise and their trading minds. All right, so I'm going to cut to the chase. I have a bit of a bias for talking trading listeners, and I guess anyone who's in the trading game and know their stuff and they think or talk like these guys. So look, just the opportunity to be able to leverage people's success and optimize their ability to go to triumph. I have a package, like you said, exciting word. So I'm calling it the Triumph After Trauma, Emerging from COVID package. And it's basically a 4-part program, Caroline. And it basically has 3 coaching sessions and a customized, call it Triumph plan. So rather than a strategic plan or a coaching plan, I'm calling it a Triumph plan because you guys don't want to just be strategic. You guys don't want to just cope and coach. You want to triumph, and I have every confidence you can. So normally that's 1,650 plus GST. I want to kind of knock 20% off for my soft spot consumers. Now, spaces are pretty booked up, but I really want to get moving on this stuff too for people. I'm also so confident in the impact this package has, and I'm so passionate about how much of a positive impact it has on people's lives. Basically, have your first session, see how it goes. If you don't get value, don't pay me. Walk away and say, hey, Sim, it's been great chatting to you. I'm not sure I'm going to get the value I'm hoping for out of this. If you do go ahead, instead of $1,650 plus GST, it's $1,300 plus GST, but you've got to let me know you're a talking trading fan. Otherwise, I'll be charging you full price. Thanks for letting me put that out there, Caroline.
That's all right, Sim. And how do people contact you?
I'd love you to go to my website at optumoutcomes.com. I'm very happy to receive a phone call, 0422 006 932. And like the other very lucky podcast interviewees, I'm hoping that you'll be able to put some links or some ways on your website to be able to reach me if you want to have a further chat.
This is V for Victory Over Trauma. Simone Dawson from Optum Outcomes, thank you so much for your insight and time.
Thank you so much. It's been such a privilege and I always love connecting with you, Caroline. Thank you.
Same here too, Sim.